Call the police.
Call the police.
Stop. You're gonna hit a pregnant woman?
No.
Get away from my wife. What the hell's your problem?
Can you call the police?
Get away.
I,
Get away from me. Go. What's your problem?
what's your problem? What's your problem?
Can you get away from my wife? I'll punch you. Get away from me.
I'm gonna punch you too.
Punch me.
Okay.
Nobody wakes up planning to destroy their own life. That is the part that should keep you up at night, because it means this can happen on any ordinary Sunday, in any ordinary coffee shop, to any ordinary family just trying to get through the afternoon. November 17th, 2024. A Starbucks. The kind of place where the worst thing that should happen is that they spell your name wrong on the cup. A pregnant woman and her partner walk in. They order. They exist. And somewhere in that act of simply existing, they trigger something in a woman nearby that she has absolutely no capacity to control and no awareness that she should. What follows is not an argument. Arguments require two willing participants. What follows is a siege. A targeted, escalating, one-sided siege against people who had done nothing except occupy the same room. And here is what makes it legally significant before a single slur is uttered, before a single officer is called. The conduct itself had already crossed a line that most people do not know exists until they are standing on the wrong side of it in handcuffs. We live in a country that is extraordinarily proud of the First Amendment, rightfully so. The right to speak freely, to hold unpopular opinions, to be offensive, to be wrong out loud. These are protections that define American liberty in ways that much of the world genuinely envies. And here is the uncomfortable truth that this woman almost certainly believed was protecting her. You are allowed to be unpleasant. You are allowed to walk into a public space and radiate hostility. You are allowed to dislike the people around you, to hold beliefs that would make decent people flinch. And no law enforcement officer on earth can arrest you for the contents of your chest. If she had stayed in her corner of that cafe, simmering quietly in whatever misery had brought her to that moment, she would have gone home untouched. The law would have had nothing to say to her. But she did not stay in her corner. This is the legal concept that destroys people who mistake cultural loudness for legal immunity. The First Amendment protects speech. It does not protect conduct. It does not protect the decision to leave your position and move deliberately towards specific individuals. It does not protect closing the physical distance between your body and the body of a pregnant woman in a way that a reasonable person would experience as threatening. It does not protect a sustained campaign of targeted intimidation against people who have demonstrated no desire to interact with you whatsoever. The moment her behavior became directional, the moment it acquired a target, it stopped being expression and started being a crime. Menacing, disorderly conduct, harassment. These are not vague concepts. They are statutes with definitions, and her behavior that afternoon mapped onto those definitions with a precision that any first-year law student could identify. Here is what the law actually asks. Not, was she speaking, but, what would a reasonable person in that situation have felt? A pregnant woman, her partner, a stranger who has decided, for reasons that will become horrifyingly clear, that their presence is intolerable. The stranger approaches. The stranger does not disengage when given every opportunity. The stranger escalates when de-escalation was freely available. At every single off-ramp, and there were many, the footage makes this undeniable. She chose acceleration instead. That pattern of choices is not protected speech. It is criminal conduct building towards something worse. And here is what makes this particular case so instructive, so important to understand fully. She was not doing this quietly. She was not a person engaged in private ugliness. She was performing, loudly, openly, with an audience of witnesses and at least one phone camera already recording before she reached peak escalation. There is a particular kind of person who has moved through life so insulated from consequence that they have lost the basic instinct for self-preservation that keeps most of us from detonating in public. She had that insulation. You can see it in her posture. You can hear it in her voice. She is not afraid of being seen. She has never had a reason to be. That miscalculation, that profound, catastrophic miscalculation, is the engine that drives everything that follows. Because every step she took toward that couple was a step toward her own arrest. Every word she chose was a brick in the prosecution's case. Every moment she stayed in that cafe when leaving was an option, was another data point confirming willful, intentional conduct rather than an impulsive moment she could later claim to barely remember. She built the case against herself with the confidence of someone who has never once been held accountable for anything. And she built it in high definition, from multiple angles, with audio clear enough to use in court. The First Amendment is a shield, but you cannot carry that shield into a Starbucks, use it to justify stalking a pregnant woman across a coffee shop, and then claim it still covers you when the slur comes out. The Constitution does not work that way. The courts do not work that way. And as she is about to discover in ways that will permanently reorder her understanding of how the world functions, consequences do not work that way either. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are on this earth, drop your location in the comments below. This footage went viral across 6 continents because what happened in that cafe is not just an American story. It is a story about power, about impunity, about what it looks like when someone has lived their entire life above the line and then, in one recorded afternoon, falls below it permanently. Subscribe right now because we are just getting started. Chapter 2 is where her psychology becomes genuinely chilling, because the very next thing she does is scream for the police while she is actively being the aggressor. And that move tells you more about who she is than anything else in this footage. Watch it again. Watch it specifically for this. Before the slur, before the officer arrives, before any of the moments that will define the legal aftermath of this afternoon, watch her scream for the police. Watch her do it with her chest out, with fury in her eyes, with the body language of someone who is unambiguously the aggressor in the room, and yet somehow simultaneously casting herself as the person who needs saving. Call the police! Call the police! As if she is the one in danger, as if she is the one who has been followed, as if the pregnant woman across from her represents a physical threat that requires law enforcement intervention. Watch it, and then sit with the discomfort of understanding that she is not confused when she does this. She is not panicking. She is executing a strategy so deeply embedded in her muscle memory that she deploys it without a single moment of hesitation. This is called preemptive victimhood. And it is one of the most insidious, calculated, and historically devastating tactics in the social arsenal of certain kinds of entitled people. The mechanism is simple in its brutality. You are the aggressor. You know you are the aggressor. On some level, even through the fog of your own outrage, you understand that a camera has captured you being the aggressor. So you move faster than the camera. You become the victim first. You call for help first. You make your name the first one in the incident report, the first voice on the 911 call, the first person to have registered distress in the official record. You do this because you have learned, either consciously through experience or unconsciously through social inheritance, that the system has historically, reflexively, automatically extended credibility to people who look like you over people who look like them. Let that sink in for a moment. Let it breathe. Because what she is doing in that moment is not simply lying. She is making a calculation about whose word the responding officers will trust. She is making a calculation about which story will land first and stick hardest. She is weaponizing law enforcement, an institution with the power to detain, to arrest, to fundamentally disrupt a human life, as a tool of harassment against people who have done nothing to her. This is not paranoia on their part. The history that makes this tactic possible is long and documented and devastating, and she is deploying it in real time, on camera, against a pregnant woman and her partner in a Starbucks. Now here is where psychology becomes genuinely extraordinary, because she does not just call for the police, she continues to escalate while calling for them. Think about what that means. A person who genuinely believes they are in danger de-escalates. They create distance. They look for exits. They do the things that frightened people do. She does none of those things. She stays. She advances. She continues to direct her aggression at the couple even as she is screaming for backup, which means she does not actually believe she is in danger. She knows on the functional level where decisions are actually made that she is not the victim. She is using the language of victimhood as a weapon precisely because she does not need it for its intended purpose. This is cognitive dissonance weaponized at scale. And it is important to name it clearly because it is the same psychological architecture that has fueled countless injustices across American history. The false accusation, the preemptive call, the tear-streaked performance for arriving officers designed to ensure that the people she targeted become the ones who face consequences. It has worked before. It has destroyed lives before. In this case, it did not work. And the reason it did not work is sitting right there in the frame of every piece of footage shot in that cafe. Multiple witnesses, multiple cameras, audio that is devastatingly clear, and a couple who understood instinctively that their recording was not optional. It was survival. Here is the irony that should make your stomach turn. She screamed for the police. She got the police. And when the police arrived, reviewed the footage, and made their determination, it was not the determination she was counting on. The system she tried to weaponize looked at the evidence and turned around and swallowed her whole. Because the cameras did not lie. The cameras had no stake in the outcome. The cameras simply recorded the truth of who did what to whom, and the truth was not complicated. The truth was not ambiguous. The truth was a woman who terrorized a pregnant woman and her partner, then tried to dress herself in the clothes of the person she had just terrorized. She did not account for the phones. She did not account for the witnesses. She did not account for the fact that the move she was making, scream first, claim victim first, let the arriving officers sort it out in your favor, is a move that only works in the dark. In the light of multiple simultaneous recordings, it becomes evidence of consciousness of guilt. It becomes proof that she understood what she was doing was wrong. Because innocent people do not need to manufacture their innocence at the volume of a woman screaming across a coffee shop. Comments are open right now. Drop where you are watching this from because this footage reached every corner of the world for a reason. People recognize this tactic. People have seen it before, in their own countries, in their own communities, in their own families. The preemptive victim is not uniquely American. She is a type. And Chapter 3 is where that type finally, irreversibly, hands the prosecution everything it needs, in one single, unretractable sentence that transforms the entire legal landscape of this case. There are moments in criminal cases where the entire trajectory of what is possible legally shifts in a single instant. Sentencing ranges change. Charge categories change. The amount of prosecutorial resources that will be deployed against you changes. The seriousness with which a judge will regard you across a courtroom changes. Everything changes. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that shift happens because the suspect themselves creates it. Not through something they did days later, not through something discovered in a search of their property, but through something they chose to say out loud, in public, on camera, to the face of the person they were targeting. What she said in that Starbucks was not just ugly. It was legally transformative. It was the moment a harassment case became a hate crime case. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony enhancement that will follow her for the rest of her life. Let us be precise about what happened because precision matters here. At the peak of this confrontation, after she had already engaged in the targeted, sustained harassment of a pregnant woman and her partner, after she had tried to preemptively claim victimhood by screaming for police, after every off-ramp had been ignored and every opportunity for de-escalation had been deliberately passed, she looked at this man and used the word. Not a slur adjacent to a racial category, not something that could be interpreted generously in another context. The specific word. The word that carries 400 years of American terror inside it. The word that, in the context of this confrontation, was not an expression of frustration, but a declaration of the belief system driving every single thing she had done since she first noticed this couple in the cafe. And in doing so, she gave the state exactly what it needed. Here is how hate crime enhancement actually works under law, because most people have a vague understanding of it that does not capture how mechanically precise it is. The underlying crime, harassment, menacing, disorderly conduct, carries its own sentencing range. The hate crime enhancement is not a separate charge in the way most people imagine it. It is a multiplier. It is the legal system's mechanism for treating a crime driven by bias against a protected characteristic as categorically more serious than the same crime committed without that bias. To apply the enhancement, prosecutors need to demonstrate that the bias was a substantial motivating factor in the commission of the underlying offense. They need to show that the victim was targeted because of their membership in a protected class. They need motive. They need evidence of that motive that can survive a courtroom. She handed them all of it, voluntarily, at full volume, on camera. The specific racial slur she used was not a slip. This is critical to understand because her defense, the defense she begins constructing in real time, the defense she continues constructing on her front porch the next morning, the defense that her attorneys will be paid to present, will almost certainly rest on the idea of an emotional moment, a slip of the tongue, a person pushed beyond her limits who said something she did not mean. Courts have heard this argument before. Courts have a mechanism for evaluating it. That mechanism is called context, and the context here is catastrophic for her defense, because you do not deploy that specific word in the heat of a moment as a random selection from your vocabulary. That word lives in a specific place inside a person. It requires a specific belief about the person it is directed at. It requires a history of holding that belief and the willingness, under sufficient provocation, which in her case was simply the existence of a couple she decided she did not want to share a coffee shop with, to express it without restraint. The prosecution does not need to prove she is a racist in her soul. Courts are not equipped to audit souls. What the prosecution needs to prove is that on November 17, 2024, inside a Starbucks, she selected a victim based on their race, targeted them with sustained harassment, and expressed the racial animus driving that harassment explicitly enough to satisfy the statutory language of the hate crime enhancement. The footage does all of that. The audio does all of that. The sequence of events, approach, escalation, refusal to disengage, slur, does all of that with a completeness that removes almost every avenue of legal challenge. There is another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed in the social media coverage of cases like this one, and it matters enormously. A hate crime is not just an offense against the individual it targets. Under the law, it is treated as an offense against the entire community that the target belongs to. The sentencing philosophy behind this, and you can agree or disagree with it, but you need to understand it, is that an act of racially motivated violence or harassment sends a message of terror not just to its immediate victim, but to everyone who shares that characteristic. It is, in a legal sense, a small act of terrorism, and courts treat it accordingly. She walked into that Starbucks with an ugliness she had probably carried for years without serious consequence. She left having committed on high-definition video with crystal-clear audio a textbook hate crime in front of multiple witnesses. The upgrade from misdemeanor to felony did not require a prosecutor's creativity. It required one word, her word, spoken freely in her own voice to a man whose partner was pregnant and who had done nothing to deserve it. Where in the world are you watching this? Comment right now because this case was followed in legal communities globally, and for good reason. Chapter 4 is where it gets psychologically fascinating in a way that will make you question everything you think you understand about how people process their own actions. Because the morning after this, when officers came to her door, what she said on that porch will genuinely leave you speechless. She answered the door the next morning and she looked like a neighbor. That is the detail that should stop you cold. Not because it is surprising that she looks like a neighbor, of course she does. She is someone's neighbor. But because of what her expression tells you about how completely she had processed the previous afternoon. She did not look like a woman bracing for consequence. She did not look like a person who had spent the night understanding that the footage was out, that it was everywhere, that the word she used was on video. She looked confused. Genuinely, not performatively confused. As if the officers on her porch were a puzzle she could not solve. As if their presence there required an explanation she was not yet able to locate. This is the good person fallacy. And it is so common, so deeply embedded in the psychological architecture of people who have never faced real accountability that it operates almost like a clinical condition. The fallacy works like this. In the internal moral accounting system of people who hold it, criminality is a character trait rather than a category of action. Bad people do bad things. Good people do not. Therefore, if I am a good person, if I have a job, a home, people who love me, a self-image assembled over decades from thousands of ordinary, decent interactions, I cannot have done something criminal. The criminal act does not fit the self-concept, so the self-concept rejects it. Not gradually, not after wrestling with it, immediately, automatically, the way a body rejects a foreign object. Watch what she does on that porch carefully. She does not deny the confrontation. She cannot. She knows what happened, but she frames it in a way that is psychologically revelatory. She characterizes herself as the wronged party. She returns, even in this moment with officers at her door, to the posture of victimhood she tried to establish in the cafe. She is not processing that she committed a hate crime. She is processing the injustice of being visited by police when she, in her own understanding of events, was the person who was mistreated. The slur, the legally transformative, felony-enhancing, irretrievable slur, either gets minimized or contextualized or explained as something that does not reflect who she really is. And this is where the fallacy becomes most visible, because who she really is, in her mind, a complete defense. As if character testimony could retroactively unspeak a word caught on camera. What is happening neurologically in people like this is genuinely fascinating in the most disturbing way. The psychologist Leon Festinger, who developed the theory of cognitive dissonance in the 1950s, described the profound mental discomfort that arises when a person's actions conflict with their self-concept. Most people, when confronted with this discomfort, will do one of two things. They will change their behavior to realign with their self-concept, or they will change their self-concept to accommodate their behavior. What they almost never do, what is psychologically extraordinarily difficult to do, is sit with the discomfort and simply acknowledge, I was wrong. I did this. This is on me. That acknowledgement requires a kind of ego strength that entitlement specifically erodes. Because entitlement, at its core, is the unexamined belief that the rules governing human conduct apply more lightly to you than to others. And people who hold that belief have never developed the internal infrastructure for genuine accountability because they have never needed it. She needed it on that porch. She did not have it. And here is where the legal stakes of this psychological failure become concrete. Because the way you conduct yourself at the moment of confrontation with law enforcement is itself legally significant. The officers at her door are evaluating several things simultaneously. Whether she poses a flight risk, whether she is likely to tamper with witnesses or evidence, whether she understands the seriousness of what she is accused of, and how her demeanor in this moment compares with the demeanor captured on the footage they have already reviewed. A suspect who opens their door, drops their shoulders and says, I know why you're here, I know what I did was wrong. That person is presenting information to law enforcement and eventually to a court. A suspect who opens their door and immediately begins repositioning herself as the victim of an injustice, who demonstrates in real time that she has learned nothing, accepted nothing, and recalibrated nothing since the moment she uttered a racial slur at a pregnant woman's partner. That person is also presenting information, different information, information that compounds rather than mitigates. The good person fallacy is ultimately fatal not because it is morally wrong, though it is, but because it prevents the only response that might have served her in this situation. Genuine, unambiguous accountability. Full acknowledgement. The kind of admission that prosecutors weigh when deciding how hard to pursue a case, that judges consider when calculating sentences, that sometimes, not always, but sometimes creates a small amount of mercy in a system that is not otherwise inclined to manufacture it. She stood on that porch with the evidence against her sitting in a detective's folder, and she wasted the last moment she would ever have to get ahead of this story. She wasted it defending a self-image that the footage had already permanently retired. He did not argue with her. That is the first thing to understand about what the arresting officer did. And it is the thing that separates skilled law enforcement from the reactive, escalation-prone encounters that end badly for everyone involved. He listened. When she spoke, he nodded. When she reframed the events of the previous afternoon in ways that were demonstrably, provably false, he did not correct her immediately. He let her continue. He made the deliberate tactical choice to be the least threatening presence in that interaction. And in doing so, he turned the conversation into something she did not realize was happening. An extended, voluntary confession session in which she provided motive, intent, and consciousness of guilt without understanding that every word was being preserved by the body camera on his chest. This approach has a name in law enforcement strategy: concessive policing. The principle is disarmingly simple and devastatingly effective. When dealing with a suspect who is emotionally activated, ego-invested in a particular narrative, and accustomed to being the dominant presence in any room she enters, the most productive thing an officer can do is temporarily yield the floor. Not because her narrative is credible, not because her version of events deserves respect, but because a person who believes they are winning a conversation will keep talking. And a person who keeps talking in the presence of a body camera is doing the prosecution's work for them. Watch the footage of this interaction closely and catalog what she volunteers. She confirms she was present. She confirms she engaged with the couple. She characterizes her engagement in ways that reveal she understood it was aggressive. She just believes her aggression was justified, which is its own form of admission. She references the slur in her attempt to contextualize it, which means she cannot later claim she does not remember saying it. She describes her emotional state in terms that confirm she was not acting in self-defense, but in offense. Every sentence she offers, filtered through the lens of someone trying to build a legal case against her, is useful. Some of it is extraordinarily useful. None of it helps her. The officer's restraint in this moment is a form of professional excellence that deserves genuine recognition. Because the easy move, the understandable human move, would have been to push back, to challenge her version of events, to point out, with the footage on his phone, exactly where her account diverged from reality. He could have done this. He had the evidence to do it. Instead, he maintained a calm that invited her to keep filling the silence, kept asking open-ended questions that gave her more rope than she knew what to do with, and gathered a voluntary statement that, combined with the cafe footage, created a prosecutorial package of remarkable completeness. There is also a physical safety dimension to this approach that matters independently of the evidentiary benefits. A suspect who feels heard, even if what they are saying is factually ridiculous, is a suspect whose adrenaline is decreasing rather than escalating. An encounter that stays verbal is an encounter that stays safe for the officers, for the suspect, and for anyone else in proximity. The officer understood that there was no version of this arrest that required force. There was no justification for escalation. The evidence was overwhelming. The suspect was on her own porch, and the most dangerous thing he could have done was match her emotional energy and turn a clean, documented arrest into something messy and complicated. He chose simplicity. He chose patience. And patience, in this context, was a weapon far more powerful than anything else available to him. What the body camera captured during this conversation also matters beyond this specific case. It establishes a timeline of the suspect's awareness. She knew in that conversation on her porch that she was being investigated for what happened in the cafe. She had the opportunity right there to make choices that would have reflected in any subsequent legal proceeding. She could have asked for an attorney. She could have declined to speak. She could have acknowledged what she did. Instead, she spoke extensively. She did so without counsel, and she did so in ways that reinforced rather than undermined the state's case. The officer's patience made that possible. His professionalism created the conditions under which she made the worst legal decisions of her life, while believing she was defending herself effectively. This is the part of criminal justice that rarely gets covered: the tactical intelligence of a well-executed contact, the strategic value of de-escalation, not just as a humanitarian principle, but as an investigative tool. He walked up to that porch with a strong case. He walked away from it with an airtight one. And she helped him do it because she could not stop talking long enough to realize that every word was ammunition. Leave your location in the comments. We want to know where in the world you are watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, you are missing the chapters where this gets even more extraordinary. Chapter 6 is about something that should genuinely give every person watching this pause, because before that officer ever knocked on her door, strangers on the internet had already identified her. And what they did with that information was both legal and absolutely decisive. She had been home for hours before anyone knocked on her door. In that time, while she was presumably reconstructing her version of events, deciding what she would say if confronted, perhaps believing that the footage would disappear into the noise of the internet, the way so many videos do, while all of that was happening, thousands of people she had never met were working. Not law enforcement, not private investigators, ordinary people sitting at home with laptops and phones and the particular kind of focused collective intelligence that the internet deploys when it decides something matters. By the time a detective formally opened a case file, the preliminary investigative work had already been done for them. Name, general location, enough contextual detail to generate probable cause and direct officers to a specific address. All of it assembled by people with no official authority, no database access, no tools beyond search engines, and the ruthless pattern-matching ability of a distributed human network that had watched the same footage several thousand times. This is open-source intelligence, OSINT, and it is one of the most profound shifts in the relationship between ordinary people and the justice system that the digital age has produced. The concept is not new. Intelligence agencies have practiced open-source collection for decades, but the democratization of it, the fact that any sufficiently motivated person with an internet connection can now participate in the kind of investigative work that previously required institutional resources, is genuinely new. And it has specific implications for anyone who commits a hate crime in a public space in the year 2024, because public space now includes its digital mirror, and that mirror has a memory that does not degrade, does not forget, and cannot be intimidated or paid off. Here is what the OSINT process actually looked like in this case, and it is worth walking through in detail because it dismantles any fantasy that there was a version of this where she walked away unidentified. The original footage was uploaded and began circulating within hours. People watched it not just with outrage but with attention, the specific, granular attention of people who understand that viral footage of a public incident is often the beginning of an accountability process rather than the end of one. Details in the background of the footage were examined. Clothing was noted. Physical descriptors were cataloged. Comments sections became coordination spaces where fragments of information were shared, cross-referenced, and refined. Some of what was posted was wrong and got corrected quickly. Some of what was posted was right and got amplified. The process is imperfect, but it is fast, and in this case, it was decisive. The legal significance of this is multiple and layered. First, The OSINT identification gave law enforcement a starting point that dramatically compressed the timeline between the incident and the arrest. Second, the independent confirmation of identity by multiple unconnected sources strengthened the probable cause calculation. Third, and this is the piece that is most important from an evidentiary standpoint, the footage analyzed by the online community contained elements that she may not have been aware were captured. The body language before the most visible moments of confrontation, the specific sequence of her movements toward the couple, the expressions on her face in the seconds before she speaks. Details that individually might seem minor, but collectively paint a portrait of deliberate, intentional, premeditated targeting rather than a spontaneous emotional outburst. Details that destroy a self-defense claim before it is even made. Her attorneys will eventually argue, they always argue, that the viral spread of the footage prejudiced the case against their client, that the court of public opinion rendered a verdict before the legal system had a chance to function. This argument is not without merit as a general principle. There are genuine concerns about mob justice and the permanence of digital shaming. But those concerns apply most forcefully in cases where the underlying facts are ambiguous, where the evidence is contested, where there is genuine uncertainty about what happened. None of those conditions apply here. What the cameras captured was not ambiguous. What the audio preserved was not contested. The OSINT process did not create a narrative. It located the person the narrative was already about. There is a lesson embedded in this chapter that extends far beyond this case, and it is a lesson that every person watching this video lives with, whether they have thought about it explicitly or not. The assumption of anonymity that governed public behavior for most of human history is gone. It has been gone for years, and some people have not yet updated their operating assumptions accordingly. You are never in a truly unwatched space anymore. Every public confrontation carries the potential to become permanent record. Every moment of cruelty or bigotry conducted in a coffee shop, a parking lot, a school hallway, a grocery store aisle. Every one of those moments now exists in an environment where a single phone camera can transform private ugliness into public accountability. She did not account for the phones. She did not account for the network. She did not account for the fact that the anonymity she had relied on to be the person she was in that cafe had already been technologically eliminated, and that the people most motivated to find her were the ones who had just watched her terrorize a pregnant woman on video. The door closes. That sound, the heavy mechanical finality of a police cruiser door sealing shut, is one of the most psychologically significant sounds a human being can hear directed at themselves. Not because of the physical reality of it. The back seat is not a cell. The restraints are not permanent. The destination is a processing facility, not a dungeon. But the sound carries with it an information load that the mind receives all at once and cannot immediately metabolize. You no longer decide when you leave this vehicle. You no longer decide where you go next. You no longer decide who you speak to or what happens to your body in the next several hours. For a person who has operated their entire life under the assumption that those decisions are simply, always, automatically theirs to make. For a person whose entire sense of self is built on the unexamined bedrock of personal autonomy, that door closing is the sound of a world ending. Watch what happens to her in the back seat. The body camera on the transport officer is still rolling. This is not a secret. This is standard operating procedure, and she almost certainly knows it on some level. What is remarkable is that she talks anyway. Not because she is unaware of the camera, because she cannot stop. Because the psychological pressure of what has just happened to her requires an outlet, and the outlet she has always used, the voice, the volume, the insistence on being heard, is the only tool she has. So she uses it. Even knowing the camera is there, even knowing that everything she says is being preserved, even knowing on the functional level where her survival instincts operate that she should stop talking immediately and request an attorney. The need to speak is stronger than the legal wisdom of silence. And in that gap between what she should do and what she cannot stop herself from doing, the prosecution finds its final gift. What she says in that back seat reveals the interior architecture of her psychology more clearly than anything she did in the cafe. In the cafe, the behavior was outward directed. It was about them, the couple, the target, the audience she was performing for. In the back seat, the audience is gone, or should be, and what comes out is the unmediated interior monologue of a person confronting the collapse of her self-narrative. She is not confessing. She is not repenting. She is not even primarily concerned with the legal consequences that are now unfolding around her with the speed of a system that has seen this before and knows exactly what to do with it. She is grieving the version of herself she woke up as that morning, the neighbor, the homeowner, the woman with a life, and struggling to understand how the woman in the cafe and the woman in this back seat can be the same person. They are, of course, the same person. They have always been the same person. The cafe version was simply the one she showed to the people she decided did not deserve the performance she reserves for those she considers worthy of it. This is the double life that bias requires. The maintenance of a public self that functions normally in acceptable company, and a private self that believes things it knows cannot be said out loud in acceptable company. The back seat of the squad car is the first place in her life, perhaps, where those two selves have been forced into the same room simultaneously, and the cognitive collision of that encounter is visible in every word she speaks. She will refocus on logistics at some point, on what happens next, on phone calls that need to be made, on people who need to know, on the bureaucratic machinery of arrest and processing that is now in motion around her, regardless of her participation. This refocus is itself psychologically revealing. It is the mind retreating from the unbearable abstract into the manageable concrete. Not because she has accepted anything, she has not, but because the abstract, I have just permanently altered the trajectory of my life by doing something I am not able to fully acknowledge that I did, is too enormous to hold. The concrete, what forms do I sign, what number do I call, is survivable in a way that the abstract is not. The hot mic in that back seat captured all of it. The grief, the logistics, the continued inability to accept accountability, the moments where something like clarity seemed to break through only to be immediately suppressed by the ego's defense mechanisms. None of it will likely become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. They do not need it. The cafe footage is comprehensive enough without it. But it becomes part of the record, part of the documented portrait of a person who, even in the back of a police cruiser, even with a body camera rolling, even with the full weight of consequence pressing down on her from every direction, could not find her way to the simple human acknowledgement that she had done something wrong. That inability, that profound, apparently structural inability, is the most damning thing about her. Not the slur, not the targeting of a pregnant woman, not the preemptive victim performance. All of those things are terrible, but the inability to reckon with them, even now, even here, speaks to something deeper. It speaks to a person who may never fully understand what she did, and that is perhaps the most chilling detail in this entire story. Comment below with your city and country. This conversation is happening globally, and we want to hear from you. Subscribe because Chapter 8 tackles something that will completely reframe how you think about every confrontation you have ever witnessed, the Initial Aggressor Doctrine, and why it meant that everything she tried to claim in her defense was legally dead before she even said it. There is a legal principle so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the architecture of criminal law, that it operates as a kind of gravitational force on any case involving a confrontation between two parties. It does not require elaborate argument. It does not require expert testimony. It requires only a clear answer to a single question. Who started it? Not in the elementary school sense of that phrase, in the precise, legally operative sense of it. Who made the first aggressive move? Whose body crossed the space between neutral and threatening first? Whose words escalated the encounter from ambient tension to active conflict? The answer to that question determines, with near total finality, who in the subsequent legal proceeding gets to claim the protection of self-defense. And in this case, the answer is captured on multiple cameras from multiple angles with a clarity that removes any possibility of honest dispute. She was the initial aggressor. This is not a conclusion that requires interpretation or inference. It is a finding that emerges directly from the footage with the straightforward logic of a mathematical proof. She approached. They did not approach her. She escalated. They did not match her escalation. She refused to disengage at every point where disengagement was available and rational. They did not advance. They stood their ground in the literal sense of that phrase. They maintained their position in a public space they had every right to occupy and responded to her aggression by documenting it. And the Initial Aggressor Doctrine says clearly, without ambiguity, that a person who instigates a conflict forfeits the legal protections that would otherwise be available to them. This matters enormously for her defense because the self-defense argument is the only viable alternative narrative available to her attorneys. Everything else in the footage is too clearly captured to dispute on the facts. The only play is to argue that her behavior, including the racial slur, was a response to feeling threatened, that she was afraid, that the couple's act of recording her constituted a form of intimidation that she was responding to defensively. It is a weak argument. It is an argument that the footage specifically and repeatedly undermines, but it is the argument they will make, because it is the only argument there is. Here is why it fails. Self-defense, under law, requires that you reasonably believe you are in imminent danger of physical harm. The word reasonably is doing enormous work in that sentence. It does not ask whether you subjectively felt threatened. It asks whether a reasonable person in your position would have felt threatened. And a reasonable person in her position, standing in a coffee shop facing a couple who are holding phones and standing still while she advances toward them, would not have felt physically threatened. A reasonable person would have recognized that the phones were recording devices, that the couple was not aggressive, that the de-escalation options available were numerous and easily accessible, and that continuing to advance and hurl abuse was a choice rather than a survival mechanism. Moreover, and this is where the Initial Aggressor Doctrine lands its decisive blow, even if she could somehow convince a jury that she felt threatened in that moment, the doctrine forecloses the self-defense claim because she created the situation that made her feel threatened. You cannot be the initial aggressor, construct a confrontation through your own escalating conduct, and then claim the protection of self-defense when the targets of your aggression react. The law is not that perverse. You do not get to ignite a fire and then claim injury from the heat. Think also about the physical geometry of the altercation. The spatial layout of that cafe is itself evidence. Cameras captured where each person was at the beginning of the encounter and where they were at the peak of it. The movement vectors are clear. She moved toward them. The distance between her starting position and her ending position represents a deliberate series of choices, each one of which can be placed on a timeline and evaluated for intent. Did she approach because she felt threatened, or did she approach in order to threaten? The footage answers this question. The answer is not in her favor. There is one more dimension of the Initial Aggressor Doctrine worth considering here, and it is the dimension that speaks to something larger than the legal specifics of this case. The doctrine exists because the alternative is intolerable. The alternative is a legal universe in which a person can select a target, provoke them beyond the point of human endurance, and then use that target's predictable human response as justification for further violence, or as the foundation of a legal defense. That universe would mean that the deliberate instigator of a conflict carries less legal risk than the person who responds to having a racial slur screamed at them in a coffee shop. The Initial Aggressor Doctrine is the law's recognition that this outcome is fundamentally unjust, and its correction for that injustice is to strip the instigator of their defensive legal options as the price of their decision to instigate. She made that decision. She made it clearly, documented on multiple cameras. The legal consequences of that decision are not a mystery or a matter of judicial interpretation. They flow directly, mechanically, inevitably from the doctrine and from the facts. And the facts are not on her side. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. This story reached legal scholars, activists, and everyday people on every continent, and we want to hear your perspective. Subscribe because Chapter 9 is the final chapter, and it is the one that ties everything together in a way that we promise you will be thinking about long after this video ends. The verdict of choices. What the permanence of the digital record truly means, and the unavoidable truth about what happens when someone with unchecked prejudice and zero impulse control walks into a world equipped to hold them accountable. Every single thing that happened to her was a consequence of a choice, not a series of unfortunate circumstances, not a misunderstanding, not a system malfunctioning in a direction that swept up an innocent person. Choices. A chain of them, each one made freely, each one building on the last, each one narrowing the universe of possible outcomes down to the one she is now living inside. This is the truth at the center of this story that resists the comfort of more complicated explanations. It was not complicated. It was a person who chose to approach, chose to escalate, chose to weaponize law enforcement, chose to stay when leaving was available, and chose, in the most legally consequential choice of all, to use a specific word that transformed the entire legal landscape of her situation. The verdict in this case was not rendered by a judge. It was rendered by her, in a Starbucks, on a Sunday afternoon in November. This is what justice looks like when all the pieces align. And the pieces aligned here not because of a perfect system. The justice system is not perfect, it has never claimed to be perfect, and anyone who has watched it operate with any seriousness understands that its outcomes are uneven in ways that track uncomfortably closely with the demographics of the people involved. But in this particular case, on this particular afternoon, with this particular constellation of cameras and witnesses, and a couple who understood that their recording was not optional, the pieces aligned. The footage was captured. The audio was preserved. The Ozent community identified her before the morning coffee was cold. The arresting officer executed a professional contact that produced voluntary self-incriminating statements. The hate crime enhancement was made available by her own explicit, recorded, unambiguous language. And every single layer of her defense, self-defense, victimhood, character testimony, emotional distress, was preemptively demolished by footage she could not dispute, created by her own conduct, in a public space she chose not to leave. Let us talk about the digital footprint, because this is the piece that extends far beyond this case into a truth about the world every person watching this video now inhabits. What she did that Sunday afternoon is permanent in a way that no human action in history has ever been permanent before. It is not just that the footage exists. Footage has always existed in various forms: security cameras, news cameras, amateur recordings. What is different now is the infrastructure for preservation and distribution. The footage of what she did has been downloaded, copied, archived, and replicated across servers in countries she will never visit, on platforms she has never used, by people whose motivation for preserving it ranges from outrage to legal documentation to simple archival instinct. It cannot be taken down in any comprehensive sense. It cannot be suppressed. It exists in a distributed way that makes its elimination technically impossible and its retrieval trivially simple for any future employer, any future neighbor, any future person who types her name into a search engine for any reason at any point in the rest of her life. This is the new reality of public conduct, and it applies to everyone, not just people with her particular flavor of hatred, not just people in Starbucks on viral Sundays. Everyone. The assumption that a bad moment in a public space will dissolve into the general noise of daily life, that assumption is structurally broken and has been broken for years. The infrastructure for permanent, searchable, distributable documentation of human conduct in public spaces exists and is only becoming more sophisticated. She walked into that cafe as someone whose private beliefs had never been subjected to public accountability. She walked out, or rather she was walked out, as someone whose private beliefs are now part of the permanent searchable record of the internet. That transition is irreversible. There is no legal mechanism, no PR campaign, no passage of time that fully closes that gap. And here is the part that should make every viewer sit with genuine discomfort, because the lesson here is not just about her. It is not a comfortable story where we observe a monster from a safe distance and feel relief at our own distance from her choices. The lesson is about impulse and consequence in a world where consequence has become instantaneous and permanent. The lesson is that the gap between the worst version of yourself and a felony charge is, for some people, precisely the width of an unchecked impulse in a coffee shop. It is the difference between the thought and the word, between the feeling and the action, between the hatred that lives in the chest and the hatred that gets spoken into a room full of cameras. She closed that gap, on camera, permanently. A pregnant woman and her partner wanted coffee. That is where this story begins. Not with a controversial political situation, not with a heated dispute where reasonable people might land on different sides. A pregnant woman and her partner, coffee, a Sunday. And somewhere in the visual fact of their presence, a woman located a hatred she could not contain, deployed it in the most legally catastrophic way available to her, and discovered, in the most irrevocable way possible, that the world she was living in was not the one she had always assumed it was. The justice system, when it functions as it is designed to function, does not ask who you are. It does not weigh your standing, your neighborhood, your self-image, or the character witnesses who would speak generously on your behalf. It looks at evidence. It reads the statutes. It applies the law to the facts that can be proven. And in this case, the facts that could be proven were comprehensive, multi-sourced, clearly captured, and legally sufficient to an extent that is almost unusual in its completeness. She made the prosecutor's job extraordinarily easy. She made the detective's job extraordinarily easy. She made the arresting officer's job extraordinarily easy. She did all of this herself, freely, with full voluntary participation, in the misguided belief that she was operating in a world that would protect her the way it always had. That world is over for her. Not because the system finally worked perfectly, not because justice is always served, but because on one specific afternoon, every variable aligned against her. The cameras were there. The witnesses were there. The OSINT community was paying attention. The officer was skilled. The law was clear. And she handed every one of these forces exactly what they needed to do the rest. Prejudice plus impulse, in the world as it exists in 2024, equals a permanent record and a felony charge. That equation does not care about your zip code, your self-concept, or how many people love you. It cares about what you did, who saw it, and whether the footage is clear. In this case, everything, everyone, and crystalline. Drop your location in the comments right now. We are building a global map of where this story landed and why it resonated. If you are new to this channel, subscribe immediately because this is what we do. We go into the law. We go into the psychology. We explain not just what happened, but why it could not have ended any other way. Share this video because this story is not just about her. It is about a moment where accountability worked exactly as it was supposed to. And in a world that often feels like it does not, that is something worth documenting, studying, and understanding completely.